Okay, hi, so good morning. Thank you all for being here for the start of our two-day conference. Some thanks are due to the Andrew Mellon Foundation for supporting this event and kind of all the things we've been doing for the next couple of years and have been doing for a year already. And to the Philosophy, Aesthetics, and Critical Theory, what is it? Thing at the philosophy department. So Ray in particular for also kind of supporting this event. And, thanks to Abdullah because, none of this would have been possible. He did everything. There's really, this whole event was organized by Abdullah and so many thanks go to him. Okay, so maybe we have some kind of just preliminary remarks about the conference, the topic of the conference, the theme, why extimacy, conference on extimacy in Beirut right now. So the last time we convened the conference here on kind of theoretical psychoanalysis, it was in 2016, and we had a Lacan contra Foucault event for some of you who may have been there, and the running joke, and I think it was Mladen's joke, was that, where else to stage a theoretical civil war between post-structuralism and Lacanian psychoanalysis, if not in the country of civil wars, so in Lebanon. And since then, a lot has happened. The long and protracted history of civil war in the past months was somewhat challenged. And it appeared for a fleeting time that there would be a success in somehow puncturing this kind of empty post-1990 temporality that we'd all been somewhat languishing in. And it appeared that an event, a protest, a riot could potentially unfold into some kind of transformative revolution. That it is, this is how it appeared, but it is now unclear whether we can still hold on to that view. And after the exhaustion of the protest has sunk in, it may somehow be fair to ask, at the risk of offense, of course, to many or to some, the question that somehow the conference may somewhat pause in its kind of larger framework is, who said that the revolution has to be so dramatic? Is the desire for revolution the same kind of desire for just about anything else? Can the desire for revolution become a process through which previous regimes of repression and canalization of desire be taken into stock, worked through, and somehow neutralized while being accounted for? And most importantly, can the desire for revolution overcome the desire to be in debt, to owe the other our enjoyment? Can the revolution become an object cause of desire, which in its very definition lies in its unattainability? Does this mean that the revolution always has to fail for its recuperation to be possible? Or put it in another way, does the revolution fail in order to be recuperated? Or does it fail because of the logic of doubling, Lacan's line about the hysteric always doubling the master? Is the revolution a form of necessary hystericization, as one would maintain somewhat happens in the analytic context? Can it not be just that? Or is there a different kind of desire at work, a different kind of enjoyment or jouissance implied in the desire for revolution? The revolution as a necessary repetition, a return to a jouissance, but can it be somewhat a return to a jouissance that is beyond the so-called fantasy of oneness? This is something that Mladen was perhaps kind of, there's discussions about this in the past 2 days in the seminar that Mladen was giving on authority. Maybe one of the signs carried by a young man during the protests revealed to us much more than the complicated theories of the event do. The sign read, as one of these young people in the protests was carrying the sign, it said, "Sex is great, but have you ever fucked the system?" And in a sense, this conference takes a cue somehow from that sign, "Sex is great, but have you ever fucked the system?" by somehow negating both propositions of the sign. Sex is not great and never will be because it doesn't work. And two, the system cannot be changed through being fucked because in the process of doing that, it can still manage to enjoy on your behalf. So, however, there's somewhat like a truth in this sign. If we disregard its signposting of so many problems from 1968, for it assumes or makes the argument that there's something about the system, about cracking the system, that has to do with sex, with desire, with enjoyment or jouissance, with the originary crack in the system, as Alenka would somehow put it. Is there a way to unscrew the cogs in the machine beyond the enjoyment of the system? So sexuation, or the problem of sex or of sexuality, is, as Alenka again puts it, out of place in human reality, yet always somehow providing it with sustenance through fantasies. In this sense, I mean, so the conference is kind of working around this question again of psychoanalysis and politics, and I think it's kind of quite well established for us that enjoyment or jouissance is a political problem, somewhat, aside for politics, because enjoyment is always about what is more in the subject than the subject, what is kind of extimate to the subject, right? So kind of extimacy, this word used by Lacan, I think once, if not twice at most, is kind of what we're trying to somehow frame this event around. Psychoanalysis in its basic proposition claims that human desire is both a site of repressive mechanisms, kind of libidinal economies that exploit the surplus enjoyment of subjects, as well as a site for their possible overcoming by the subject. Thus, desire, enjoyment, and fantasy, for kind of Freudo-Lacanian psychoanalysis, are never reducible to kind of individual private problems and are always already somehow the function of the group and the individual. So desire is intriguing because it is not only a link of integration, of integrating the subject and the other, despite all the claims that have been made in kind of accounts of desire under the kind of this kind of schema of kind of the repressive hypothesis, but desires kind of it's not a kind of a link of integration, but always kind of an articulation of, again, this kind of extimacy, this kind of nodal notion that we're trying to kind of work around. So the object cause of desire, or the objet of desire, is as such not an a priori. It cannot be represented before it is experienced as that which founds the alterity of the other, who in turn does not exist yet somehow functions. And so kind of, we're kind of just like, these are like preliminary, I mean, thoughts on how to kind of, why extimacy, what is extimacy? I mean, there's more I want to say, but I think Surti wanted to jump in here, or would you?
Yeah, I can, sure. I mean, I don't have that much to say. You have a lot prepared, but maybe I'll just return to something that you said in the very beginning. And so you said something like, how the desire for revolution can become a process through which previous regimes of repression and canalization of desire can be taken into stock, worked through, and somehow neutralized while being accounted for, right? And this is sort of in the face of this loss of a real kind of transformative revolution, as you phrased it. And it struck me as something that resounds a lot with Kristeva's notion of revolt, right? And she has this project, where for her, revolt is also precisely this kind of return, this turning back, this displacement, this change, that is a questioning and displacement of the past, precisely also for her in the face of this loss of a transformative revolution, right? So there's revolt, but no real revolution. And so from her perspective as well, I mean, given what she thinks are sort of these cataclysmic shifts in society, the decline of paternal authority, religious values, and ever-intensifying mass-mediated society, which is always dislocating power from its traditional structures, revolt can no longer be thought of as transgression against the law from her perspective, and prohibitive political structures. Right? There's sort of this marked shift in the very structure of power against which one might revolt. So the question for her is really about how can we think about revolt when power is more diffuse and difficult to identify, but furthermore, how can we think about the loss of the very desire for revolt itself? And so for her, this of course creates a very bleak picture of the political possibilities of the subject, right? So a quote from her, she says, "Against whom can we revolt if power is vacant and values corrupt? Or to put it even more gravely, who can revolt if man has become a simple conglomerate of organs, no longer subject, but a patrimonial person?" Right, so on her picture, it's not even that the subject simply recedes, that the subject is pessimistic or nihilistic or stoic from these sort of overwhelming changes, but rather subjectivity itself undergoes this very dramatic change, and that becomes a block to action. So what she calls this patrimonial person, the person that's so thoroughly alienated from themselves, who view themselves as this kind of conglomeration of organs, right? Something that is inherited that can just be as easily disposed of. So in this case for her, the only thing that revolt can be is this kind of what she calls an anamnesis, a movement of revolt that returns to the past, that repeats, interrogates, reelaborates the most archaic, intimate phases of psychic development. So, and in this sense, it's for her, it's not to return to a kind of a subject that is more whole, or that there's this kind of plenitude of being, but it's to expose this kind of irreconcilable conflict at the heart of the subject, right? And negativity in thought and being that for her is somehow linked to some notion of freedom that's otherwise blocked. So this kind of return, this encounter with a fractured subjectivity, this encounter with negativity, is for her both blocked and yet is the potential challenge to the contemporary social conditions in which individuals also experience a kind of separation or alienation or loss from themselves and from others. So of course this, and so she goes through sort of like the history of negativity in philosophy, looking at Heidegger, looking at Sartre, looking at Freud, to try to recover some notion of negativity that can provide this kind of return or this recovery. But then, of course, this kind of return is also severely criticized, right? There's a lot of criticism of what this return can mean. Is it sort of just kind of forestalling real change, a kind of defeatist gesture, a kind of, how is this any different from pop psychology, the pop psychology of self-care, that if we cannot actually have any real change, then we must sort of work on ourselves, right? So there's this sort of, this criticism of her, but I think this gesture is interesting because even if the social remains weak on her account, and it's very weak, it's not fleshed out, it gives us a kind of link through this emphasis on negativity to what I would then go to another model, right? Like kind of a dialectical materialist model to draw out that kind of social aspect that is very weak on her account, right? But there is this kind of return, this negativity to the subject on her side, which then I would fill out with this sort of material account, which I don't know if we have time for, but I can, very quickly if you want. Or.
I mean, I guess given that this is, I mean, I guess the idea is that how can, the discussion was how is extimacy a crucial kind of somehow,
yes, exactly.
So much comes around it in psychoanalysis,
exactly.
right? The relationship of the subject to the other, to this kind of the subject as the extimate point of the other, and then also is there a way to use extimacy to also kind of open up problems in kind of philosophical, critical, theoretical,
so what I was going to suggest is
through
that
psychoanalysis is extimate relationship to both kind of like politics and philosophy.
Sure.
Somehow.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that if we go towards the other side, then we start to develop a kind of dialectical material understanding of negativity. There's a kind of scission between the two models, right? That I think extimacy can help us think through, and precisely the relationship between psychoanalysis and social critical theory. Maybe then I'll just let you. So why don't you talk about extimacy? Why don't we talk about what this thing is?
This is a funny introductory because the plan is to, of course, turn this into something, right? To kind of turn this into a publication, of course, with everybody's papers who are part of the conference, but also it's kind of an ongoing conversation about this. I don't know. We can just also stop now and then.
Yeah, we can also stop.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's. We can start. This is kind of a beginning of a discussion, I suppose. But I mean, I was going to say again for people who kind of somewhat are here, but this word extimacy, what is its use, or how has it been somehow? Just some kind of points about the way that kind of the way that Freud introduces this. Or Lacan sees Freud introducing this a question of extimacy already, but Lacan kind of coming up with this neologism, using it not more than kind of twice, and just to kind of again, some of the ways that Lacan describes extimacy, right, is that, as he puts it in kind of, I think, the seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis, quote, the central place, this intimate exteriority, the extimacy, which is the thing, this thing that Lacan describes as the excluded interior, the subject's inside, which becomes the first outside, the first exteriority around which the subject orients his way. This thing, as again Lacan says, is the first landmark, the same place where the subject returns to. And Lacan describes this extimate place, although I guess, Sama would, this is not to be understood in classical understandings of space, by way of an even more kind of enigmatic biological analogy. And there's these two moments in Freud and Lacan that are very interesting, where they talk about this thing where first Freud, describes, or Lacan describes the thing as a unicellular organism's vacuole, an empty place, a void, which in a cell acts as an empty sac that somehow stores water in preparation for osmosis to come. And the choice of the analogy for Lacan is really intriguing because we can only kind of somewhat recall Freud's invocation of a similar biological reference to describe the ego in his essay on narcissism from 1914, where he describes the ego as this kind of amoeba, and the process, this kind of pseudopodia it puts out, the way it kind of engorges the object outside it. And Freud describes the process of narcissistic identification as this way of kind of the ego morphing itself into an image of its own self. But the question is, I mean, where does the image come from? Or better even, how can the ego identify with its image if it's not prior somehow to its image? And this kind of this morphing that Freud describes, this process of identification, doesn't simply retroactively project an image of an ego that was not already there, but somehow carries out this projection through a specific desire, what Freud calls an original libidinal investment. And it's this kind of originary kind of anamorphosis that splits the ego. So the ego is split by its very own image of itself. And, you know, this is the account that Freud gives of a narcissistic identification. And of course, the process of identification for Freud is always kind of occurs through kind of what Freud calls this kind of magical thinking, the formative myth of the I, the thaumaturgic force of words, all these techniques developed for somehow dealing with the external world. So love, magic, and other techniques are the ones that the ego used to develop its sense of interiority and exteriority. And what's interesting here, and this is kind of the way that Lacan kind of seems to follow through this Freud's reading, is that, you know, Freud somehow is discovering that there's a stimulus that somehow precedes the ego, kind of a constitutive discord, a privation that somehow transforms into a demand. And it's very, you know, this is a crucial place for kind of Lacan's return to Freud and kind of developing a concept of the drive as what is kind of irreducible to the struggle between life and death, or the struggle between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. And so it's this is kind of the line that, you know, kind of, so the question of the drive becomes crucial to the problem of extimacy in a certain sense, as this kind of somehow that which is before that somehow repeats itself, but it is only, as kind of Alenka puts it, a repetition of what is impossible to be repeated. So this is a very interesting, I mean, so this is kind of like the implications of kind of extimacy and for kind of almost all the kind of crucial concepts of psychoanalysis. And so it's kind of, Lacan returns to this use of Freud, this kind of this problem of the primary demand, this demand to be deprived of something real, a kind of a demand that precedes its own repression and that somehow coincides with primary symbolization, or the birth of the symbolic, you know, out of the pangs of the real. And again, here it's the whole problem is articulated in terms of extimacy. So I'm just kind of like, these are just kind of general remarks of kind of this, how extimacy is crucial for these all these moves kind of from Freud to Lacan. And maybe we just kind of I don't know, stop here. I mean, if you want to.
Yeah, no, we can stop. I mean, we don't have to. We're not really giving a paper.
Yeah, it's
we
very
just
narcissistic. Yeah. Okay. No, so I mean, we can just. Yeah, I mean, but these are kind of by way of just kind of some general remarks about kind of why extimacy. You know, why this word, and of course why here, because it's also a question that seems to carry within it, you know, all these problems: repetition, drive, the relation between subject and other. This kind of. And crucially, around there is floating consistently this problem of politics, right? How does politics somehow, or how can we think about, you know, the political in relationship to this notion in psychoanalysis of kind of extimacy? Okay, so
yeah. So
yeah, we can. So yes, we'll introduce Alenka now. I think you're giving the first talk. I don't know if we have a coffee break before or.
And let me just also thank Nadia actually for all the work in putting this conference together and this sort of very fortuitous coming together of this other project that you had going on. So this is really wonderful. We have a really full program and it looks great. So thank you, Nadia, as well.
Okay, so.